This man rescued a drowning tiger cub after he saw how much its mother was in despair. A few years later, a true miracle happened. Ivan and his wife Anna lived with their son Nikolai in a small town near Moscow. Ivan was a hard-working farmer who spent most of his days tending to his crops and animals, while Anna took care of the household chores and looked after Nikolai. Despite their humble lifestyle, Ivan and Anna were a happy couple and loved their son dearly. Nikolai was a curious and adventurous boy who was always eager to explore the world around him. Ivan always liked to joke that Nikolai got his adventurous spirit from his grandfather Arthur. As a young man, his grandfather would spend all his free time exploring new places, trying new things, and pushing himself to the limits. He was always searching for the next big adventure, and nothing could hold him back. Years went by, and Archer eventually settled down and started a family. He still loved adventure, but his priorities had shifted. He would tell his children about his experiences, and they would listen in awe, amazed by their father's bravery and spirit of adventure. One day, the man called his son, Ivan. He missed his grandson and wanted him to come spend a few weeks at his place. Nikolai was excited to go as his grandfather always had lots of amazing stories to tell about his past adventures. 2 days later, the excited young boy sat at his grandfather's feet as he narrated yet another story to him. This time, it was the story of how he had rescued a tiger cub from drowning. It happened later in his life when all the kids had moved out, and it was just him and his wife. On one of his hiking trips, Arthur had been walking along the riverbanks, enjoying the peaceful sounds of nature, when he heard a strange noise. It sounded like an animal in distress. He followed the sound and soon saw a tiger cub barely keeping its head above water. The little cub paddled frantically, but the strong current pulled it downstream. Arthur could see the panic in the cub's eyes as it struggled to stay afloat. Without hesitation, he plunged into the water and began swimming towards it. The cub was even more frightened as he approached and tried to swim away. Archer saw that it was exhausted and weak, and he knew he had to act quickly. He made soothing sounds to calm it and slowly moved towards it. The cub eventually stopped resisting and allowed him to get closer. Arthur reached out his hand and carefully lifted the cub's front paws onto his shoulder. He then held its body against his chest, keeping its head above water. He spared a single second to marvel at the whitish color of its fur before he started swimming. The cub was surprisingly heavy, and Arthur could feel the strength of the current pulling them both downstream. He began swimming towards the riverbank, but the current was getting stronger, and his destination seemed so far away. Arthur had to use all his strength to keep them afloat. He could feel his muscles straining, but he refused to give up. The cub was now completely still, its eyes closed as if it had given up hope, but the determined man refused to let that happen. He kept swimming, his strokes becoming slower and more deliberate. Finally, he saw a fallen tree branch up ahead. It was his only chance to rest and gather his strength. He swam towards the branch and grabbed onto it with one hand. With the other hand, he held the cub tightly, ensuring it was safe. Arthur took a few deep breaths and rested his tired muscles. The cub was still breathing, but barely. Arthur could feel its small body shivering in his arms. He knew they had to get to the riverbank soon, or the cub might not make it. With renewed energy, Arthur started swimming again. This time, he could feel the cub's body starting to warm up against his chest. It was a good sign. He swam with all his might, focusing only on the bank ahead. As he finally reached safety, he collapsed onto the ground, exhausted. The cub was still in his arms, but now it was breathing more steadily. Arthur looked down at it and smiled. He had saved a life, and it was a feeling he would never forget. Unknown to him, an unexpected witness awaited on the other side of the river. As he stroked the cub, Arthur looked up to see an adult tiger watching him from a distance. He was startled at first, but from the look on the tiger's face, he could sense her concern. This was probably the cub's mother. She must have been unable to save the cub and was now waiting for the brave human to return it. As the tigress approached him slowly, he left the cub and stood a few meters away. Arthur watched from a safe distance as she approached the cub and nuzzled him. It was such a beautiful sight, and he was glad to have been instrumental in their reunion. Years passed, but Archer never forgot about his encounter with a tiger cub. Winter came early that year, and all the lakes and rivers were freezing up. The landscape was gorgeous, so he decided to go hiking one day. Everywhere looked so magical in its fresh white coat of snow, and Arthur spent his time taking in the beauty of the terrain and enjoying the stillness in the air. He spent a significant amount of time outside, and he decided to head home when it started to get dark. On his way back, he came across a frozen lake. He knew the chances of the lake being safe to cross were low, but he was too tired to go around it, so he decided to risk it. The ice seemed sturdy, and he let out a sigh of relief. However, it seemed like he had concluded too early, because just as he took his next step, he heard the ice crack. Arthur knew it was a sign of grave danger, but it was too late. The sheet of ice broke, and he fell into the freezing water. The cold water numbed his body, making it hard for him to move. He tried to swim, but was too weak, and the icy water kept dragging down his heavy clothes. He kept trying to stay afloat, but the cold kept cutting through him, and he could not feel his limbs. Arthur felt himself losing consciousness. He tried his best to stay awake and afloat, but it was a losing battle. He felt his hold on reality slipping away, but just before his eyes closed, he saw a blurry figure above him and felt something pulling him upward. The man kept slipping in and out of consciousness as something kept pulling him towards the firm ground. Finally, they reached the shore, and Archer was gently set down on the ground. He was shivering uncontrollably, but the blurry figure next to him was big and warm, and it didn't leave his side for a second. The thing even licked his face, trying to warm him up with its breath. Arthur woke up some minutes later to the biggest shock of his life. He felt something warm on his face, and when he opened his eyes, he saw a huge tiger licking him. His first instinct was to panic. Was he going to be eaten alive? The man was confused and scared, but when he summoned the courage to look at the tiger's face, he felt a little bit relieved. There was something about it that felt familiar, and he hoped that he was right. This was the cub that he had rescued a few years back. He could never forget its unmistakable white coat and its big brown eyes. A wave of gratitude washed over Arthur, and he felt tears in his eyes. His kind gesture all those years ago paid off in a way he would never have imagined. The tiger helped him as he stood to his feet and supported him as he returned home. When they got to the edge of the forest, the big cat paused and wouldn't go any further. It watched as Arthur walked home and slipped away quietly. From that day onwards, Arthur knew he owed his life to the tiger. He had experienced a true miracle and knew he would never forget it. There was a sheen of tears in his eyes as he finished narrating the story to his grandson. Little Nikolai was amazed at the wonderful story, and from that day on, tigers were officially his favorite animals.